Two for two, boys. Same session as What If Deku Became an Otsutsuki Part 0. Oh, my bad. What's going on, guys? It's Tepesh, and I'm here to bring you What If Deku Had a Dragon Quirk Part 2. Dos. Duos. So yeah, this is I'm recording this immediately after I just got done recording What If Deku Became an Otsutsuki Part 0. After this, I'm going to do What If Deku Became an Otsutsuki Part 1. And then I'm going to continue writing What If Deku is the son of Esdeath. It sounds like a lot, but this is actually a lot of fun for me, so I hope you guys enjoy it too, because I'm really enjoying making these. Let's see. Oh, real quick note. In order to put both Iki and Rumi in Class 1A, Ojiro and Hagakure, I think the guy with the tail and the invisible girl, will replace Ren and Yanagi in Class 1B. Mineta stays in the class because even though he's virtually worthless for the most part, besides being a pervert, he has his moments, so he stays. In any case, let's get started on Part 2 and hope that my throat doesn't fail me before I finish this. So Deku opens the door to room 1A, hoping that either Rumi or Ida is in his class, and praying that Bakugo isn't. But when he opens the door, he finds that all three of them are talking. More like Ida and Bakugo are arguing as Rumi listens. And Deku just laughs and says, "Just my luck." And seeing Deku by his door, both Rumi and Ida leave Bakugo, just ignore him, and they're like, "Izuku." And Ida says, "Congratulations. I saw that both you and Usagiyama placed third in entrance exams." And he bows to Izuku and says, "I also know now that you managed to discern the true meaning of the practical test. I was blind." Deku smiles as he pats Ida's shoulder and says, "Don't sweat it." And but on the inside he's thinking like, I didn't even know what was going on. So Rumi placed her fist on Deku's chest and says, "Don't think I'll back down after that. I'll beat you next time." And he grins and says, "We'll see." And behind Deku, Ochako appears and she says, "Ah, the boy with the long hair. Thank you for saving me again last time. I'd be a goner without you. I'm Ochako Uraka, by the way." Izuku nods and says, "Izuku Midoriya, don't sweat it. This is Rumi Usagiyama, and that one is Ida Tenya." And, the three introduce themselves to each other, and they begin talking about quirks. And Deku sees his sister from behind Ochako. He's about to say hi, however, at her feet is a yellow sleeping bag with a tired-looking man inside. Iki sighs and just says, "He made me roll him here." She seemed tired after doing that, and Aizawa gets up and says, "Alright everyone, take your seats." Aizawa introduces himself, or more like Deku does, and then he talks about UA and tells everybody to meet him outside in their gym clothes. And that's the start of the various trials that they have. As Bakugo still makes first in the exam, he's asked to throw the ball and he gets the same score. It doesn't change. I think it's like 730. But yeah, Jesus Christ. Aizawa tells the class that if whoever gets last gets expelled, and they all get worried. And the tests officially start. Now, in these tests, I did say I was going to make Izuku overpowered. He's not yet. So in these tests, the only one that he really excels in is the arm grip, but he still kind of loses to Shoji. He gets 520 kilograms, whereas he gets 530, and that's while he's using his gauntlet. Because the only parts of his armor he can manifest are his arm pieces. It doesn't really have much of an effect on the trials, since a lot of them are like racing, long jump, side steps, things like that. So he relies on the arm grip and the ball throw in order to get the best scores. And of course, he's still the last person to do the ball throw. So for that, he just decides to go all out, no holding back. And Aizawa says start. And in his mind, Deku right now is at 15th place. And even though he isn't in last, if he fails this one, he will be. So, Aizawa's like, well, it sucks, but if he fails, I'm gonna expel him like I said I would. And, Bakugo's thinking like, oh, shit, who's gonna fail? whatever. And so Deku grits his teeth, and his eyes turn slit once again, like a dragon, and his fangs grow in, and both arm pieces up to his shoulders form. And as that happens, it shocks everyone, especially Bakugo. He's beyond shocked, even more so when he saw Deku throw the ball in cannon. His grip on the ball almost crushes it as he reels back and throws it as hard as possible, and like a burst of air just like explodes as the ball flies into the air. Aizawa looks at it with the tracker, and his eyes widen a bit before he shows the number to the class, and it is 1200. Ikki and Ida smile without much surprise because they knew, they knew that it would be something like that. And Rumi just laughs and says, "There it is. I knew you wouldn't disappoint." And the others look at awe and they're like surprised and stuff like that. And a certain jackass decides to try to attack Deku, and he says, "Explain, shit stain. How did you?" But before Bakugo can really reach Izuku, who wasn't prepared for Bakugo to attack him, Aizawa uses his cloth to hold him in place, and he tells Deku good job, and he displays the scores, and of course he says, "Oh yeah, the expulsion thing was a lie. Haha, I get tricked." In the end, Rumi placed 4th while Ito placed 5th, and Deku landed right behind Shoji at 7th. Aside from that, the rest of the placements remain about same. It doesn't really matter in the first place anyway. But yeah, Aizawa catches All Might watching from behind the building, and as the kids are leaving for the day, and they have a similar conversation, but most of that stays the same. Classes are normal as expected until they're classed with All Might, and he hands them their hero costumes and has them walk into the performance ground for the battle trial. Rumi's hero suit is similar to her canon one, but because her older sister took the white variation, hers will be jet black. She also wears a mask that hangs on her neck. She has that. She also got that idea from her sister, but for the most part, it's gonna be her same suit, just a color change. As for Ikki and Deku's outfits, hers looks like this. I'm gonna put up a picture right now, only with green and not red. Deku's looks like Squall's, if you've ever seen his, and I'm gonna show it right here. And I know these aren't really like hero outfits at all, but for Ikki, that's just a design that she likes. But for Deku, because his armor pretty much covers his body anyway when he transforms, he thought that a full-on costume would just kind of be wasted when he's not going to be seen in it most of the time. So he just decided to opt for something cool. And plus, I like it. Oh, also the sleeves on Squall's outfit, the sleeves aren't there for Deku. So it's kind of like a sleeveless jacket. All Might compliments the group on their suits, directing his gaze toward his 2 kids especially. He likes them. He likes the suits. He then explains how the battle trial will function, and he goes on about how there'll be like 2-2 fights between heroes and villains, and he begins to pair people up accordingly. Now this is just his bias, but All Might pairs Deku and Ikki together because he wants to gauge their ability to work together. Rumi is paired with Bakugo, and that scares the shit out of everyone because they're both insane. Ida is paired with Ochako, and the rest are pretty much the same. He reaches into the 2 boxes and pulls out the 2 orbs, and of course, both A and D. So the first round of the battle trial is Izuku and Ikki versus Rumi and Bakugo. Izuku and Ikki spend 5 minutes, the 5 minutes that the villain team uses to get to the bomb, to memorize the layout of the building. And once the trial starts, the twins easily infiltrate into an open window on the building and scan their surroundings to ensure they aren't being ambushed or anything. And Ikki turns to her brother and says, "So, little brother, what's the plan?" Deku just shakes his head and says, "You seriously want to let that negligible height difference go, huh? If my guess is right, both Rumi and Bakugo will be gunning for me, for different reasons, but the means don't change the ends. Even then, both are too careful to just let you get close to the bomb. They'll be waiting somewhere close to the bomb so that they can quickly return if you're not with me." She nods and says, "What should we do then? I have confidence in taking them on one-on-one, but fighting both those monsters at once is something I do not want to try." He laughs and says, "Same here, but I have a plan. It hinges on how well you can control your flames, though." And so she nods, and the twins begin to discuss their plans and make their way to the floor right below the bomb. And as they make it to the floor, almost immediately, Rumi and Bakugo rush Deku with an explosion and a kick, respectively. Deku forms his arm pieces and barely catches both of them, throwing them in the opposite directions. And he turns back to Iki and says, "Follow my lead!" Iki nods and uses her modified lighter to create a thorn flame whip and takes advantage of the tight hallways to pressure both of them with her relentless attacks. I kind of pictured it like if you've seen The Last Airbender, that scene where Zuko attacks Aang in the beach house and he shoots fire at him in a hallway. It's something like that. So she's like just ruthlessly attacking them in the hallway and just pressuring them to get them to stay back. But Bakugo and Rumi, because they're monsters when it comes to this kind of stuff, they manage to slowly close in while avoiding the whip. And without warning, she lets the whip dissipate and steps back as Izuku inhales and releases a ball of flame that like zoomed past the pair and shot out the window. And Bakugo sees this and he smiles and he's like, "So you really do have a quirk, Deku." And Bakugo runs past Rumi and swings at Deku with an explosion in hand, but he was countered and flipped onto the ground like in canon. Rumi was intercepted by Iki, who was using flame bullets to keep the pressure on her. And as they were fighting, Izuku turned back to Iki and says, "Status!" And he dodges one of Bakugo's attacks and pushes him back. And Iki turns to him and she says, "It's up." And he nods and goes, "Okay, switch!" And the two very quickly and cleanly switch opponents, and the tide of the battle changes completely. Before Izuku and Iki were on the defensive, they were just keeping Rumi and Bakugo at a distance to minimize the pressure. But now, it was like they had hard countered their opponents entirely. Through his many spars with Rumi, Deku and Rumi were absolutely like tied with each other, so she couldn't get past him and he couldn't really push her back, but he was still keeping her at bay. As for Iki, she was a huge bane for Bakugo's quirk. She was able to like lessen the power that he had for them and pretty much nullify them completely, so he had to rely on hand to hand to fight with her. And even though it was a lot better than using his quirk, it still wasn't enough to get them down before he ran out of stamina. And Bakugo just got tired of this shit, and he finally turned to Deku and he's like, "Fine, if you won't fight me for real, Deku, then I'll just hit you with everything I have." And Bakugo's face is just crazy as shit as he points his hand towards Izuku and pulls the pin on his arm grenade. And All Might sees this and immediately slams on his hand on the table and says, "Young Bakugo, stop this at once. You'll kill them and your partner." And Bakugo, like the psycho he is, just yells, "They won't die if they dodge it." Izuku very quickly realized that Bakugo's attack would be like extremely dangerous. So he yells at Ruby and Iki to get back and grab them both, throwing them behind him. And he activates both arm pieces again and pulls out his spear as well. And veins start appearing on his hands as he screams and throws the spear down at the exact same time as the blast from Bakugo's hand grenade is released. And the pressure from Izuku's attack managed to split the explosion in two, but a good portion of his arms weren't really spared. As the dust settles, All Might and the others saw panting Izuku holding the spear with his horribly charred arms, like his arms are screwed up. From his knuckles up to, I'd say right before his biceps, like those parts are like just completely messed up. And he grit his teeth in pain, but he was glad that when he turned around, both Rumi and Iki were pretty much fine. And Iki looks at her brother like super concerned. She's like, "Izuku, are you?" And he turns to Iki and says, "Iki, finish it!" And she was hesitant at first because she was more worried about him, the test. But she nodded and closed her eyes. And when she reopened them, they were flaming. Like the Human Torch, kind of like that, but her whole body's not on fire. And the moment she did so, the forest comms lit up and a roaring voice was heard. And it said, "The hero team wins!" Both Bakugo and Rumi were caught off guard completely. And Iki ran to hug her wounded brother in excitement. And the three returned to All Might in the monitor room, who began to evaluate the four on their actions. As for Izuku, he was taken away by the robots to Recovery Girl to get his arms healed. And All Might tallies everything up and he basically says, "Young Iki was the MVP of this match. Can anyone explain why?" And Yaoyorozu raises her hand and she answers, "Because she played her role the most efficiently during the match." Bakugo seemed to be driven by some personal grudge that affected his ability to properly communicate with his partner, and Usagiyama focused more on targeting Midoriya than helping her partner when she needed it most, the complete opposite of the hero team. Both Midoriyas communicated and fought the villain team in a coordinated and effective manner, switching when the situation benefited them most. Izuku only fell off when he attempted to tank Bakugo's attack head-on, but it was a matter of quick thinking rather than poor choice. Iki, however, focused on using that flame her brother shot through the window to capture the bomb while keeping the villain team occupied. She committed to their plan almost flawlessly. All Might is just completely taken aback by her attention to detail, but he just nods. He's like, yeah, you're right. And Rumi's like, so that's why we lost. He won again, damn it. And like Ken and Bakugo is just completely shaken by his loss and remains quiet as All Might tries to, give him his condolences. But after that, the other matches pretty much go the exact same as they did before. Ida and Ochako win their match, by the way. I didn't really pair them with anyone. It's just a match and they won it. In any case, everybody, the class ends and everybody returns to the main building. And unlike Canon, Recovery Girl doesn't berate All Might, since this is technically the first time Izuku was badly injured. And he just sends the boy on his way. And though they didn't realize it, Izuku, Iki, Bakugo, and Rumi were all thinking the same thing after their match, and that was that I'm too weak. For Izuku specifically, he had come to realize he had no way to deal with with opponents who were just far faster or stronger than him. He was only able to match Rumi and Bakugo because of his extensive knowledge on them, but if that fight had gone on longer, their adaptability would have probably overtaken him. He thought that he relied too much on his passive abilities and decided that he needed something better. And as he was contemplating what he should do next in order to train his quirk, he looked up and saw Rumi standing near the 1A door. He says, "Hey Rumi, what are you standing there for?" And she shuts him up and says, "Stand still." And before he can even respond, she had closed in on him and kissed him on the cheek before stepping back. And she says, "Thanks for saving me during the battle, and congrats on winning." Even though he was taken aback, like, he's like, "Oh shit, that actually happened?" But he managed to bounce back rather quickly, and he's like, "Don't take it to heart, Rumi. We had a very clear advantage with Iki countering Bakugo's quirk in our teamwork. Doesn't make you any less strong, trust me." And she nods and turns back to the classroom. She's like, "I know that. Just watch. Next time we fight, I win by a landslide." And he laughs, and they walk back together to Class 1A. And meanwhile, in a bar far off from the school, Shigaraki is talking to All For One. He says, "Hey master, are you sure this thing can kill All Might?" And he turns his direction to the burly Nomu silently sitting in the corner. And All Might says, "My predictions are correct, and that and more some. I obtained very helpful data from little Izuku regarding effective quirk combinations. This Nomu I have provided you shall work wonders on Mr. Number 1. Speaking of, I wonder if my gift will manifest soon." Following the battle trial, Izuku and Rumi trained together while Iki spars to All Might for the most part. Everyone went about their rather normal school lives as the day came when they would go to USJ. Aizawa announces it to them, and on the bus, Izuku is seated next to Suyu and Ida, and across from him are Rumi, Iki, and Kaminari. After a bit of talking, Suyu turns to Izuku and asks him something. "Hey Izuku, I always say what's on my mind. What exactly is your quirk?" And if you're wondering why I didn't do the froppy voice, no, I can't do it. Kaminari nods and says, "Yeah, it looks like an enhancement type quirk, but then you can make a spear to go with it. It's manly, man." And Rumi also nods and she says, "It gives up the feeling of a beast type quirk, but you can freely change in and out of it." And Izuku ponders this, but Iki attempts to give her own response, and she says, "To be honest, we're not really sure. When we went to retest it at the doctors, they said it was somehow a dormant quirk, even more mutated than before. It's so mutated that the only similarity he shares with our parents' quirk is his fire breath." Deku nods and says, "Yeah, I really can't say for sure what my quirk is, but I feel sometimes it responds to my needs on its own." I can't explain it well, but sometimes I think that my quirk may be alive in some way. And hearing this, Rumi sighs and says, I hate to agree with something like that, but I have to acknowledge that it's not all that crazy a theory. Even the way it manifests on your arms makes it look alive. Tokiyami turns around from his seat and says, is it really that strange? My dark shadow has a bit of a conscience itself. And Deku smiles and nods and says, true. No matter what, a quirk is a quirk. It has to be used, and sooner rather than later. The others agree with Deku, but something about his words gave them a somewhat uncomfortable feeling. But that feeling was completely washed over by Kirishima, however, as he started another topic. Man, Izuku, those scars are super manly. How'd you get them? Iki turns to Izuku with a mocking grin and she says he got him using his quirk for the first time a little over a year ago. And Izuku laughs because he didn't tell them that he actually got them fighting to the death with Nomu. He just told them that, he got them while he was training his quirk. So they just believe that. And Rumi says, right, I remember you said you had a dormant quirk until now. How'd you unlock it? And as Deku was about to answer, he felt a tingling in his head and closed his eyes. And almost immediately he saw a vision of a familiar looking man in a nice suit. The man seemed to speak something that made Izuku's head hurt. Then he opened his eyes once again, and the only thing that came out of his mouth was accept. But before he could finish that sentence, Aizawa says, alright, calm down, we're reaching our destination soon. As he says that vision of a certain individual fades from Izuku's head, and he just shakes his head and turns to USJ. And everyone's, they're in awe of the scene, except for maybe Bakugo and Todoroki, who don't give a shit. But the class exits the bus and enter the USJ building, where they're greeted by number 13, who Izuku and Ochako both still fanboy over. However, Izuku's the first to notice the warp gate slowly forming in the center. His eyes widen in shock because he notices that gate, and he turns to Aizawa, who gives him a strange look. And he immediately activates his arm pieces and spear, and he yells, intruders! Aizawa turns his head to see the warp gate, and he sees Shigaraki, the Nomu, and multiple other thugs appear from the warp gate and swarm the area. The others are beyond shocked, and though Izuku is too, he manages to keep a bit of a level head after remembering Shigaraki and the formless man, Kurogiri. And Izuku turns to everyone, he's like, everyone, run to the entrance! The one with the warp gate can create multiple gates. We need to go before he catches us in one. And Aizawa turns to him and says, are you sure? And Izuku nods and says, I met those two before. The one with the hands all over his body seems to be able to hurt any others by touching them with all 5 fingers. Be cautious. And Aizawa nods and slides on his goggles and says, you two, guide these students out of here. I'll deal with them. Izuku turns to the group and begins running. And he says, come on guys, we need to alert the pro heroes outside. And the group all races towards the entrance, but they were still stopped by Kurogiri, who, he professes that they've all come to kill All Might. And Bakugo and Kirishima attack the man, and it doesn't work. And he uses his warp gate to surround everybody and sends them to the different places. Izuku, Tsuyu, and Mineta still land in the flood zone and are on that boat with all those people there. And the trio will make it onto the boat safely, thanks to Tsuyu again, where they study their aquatic foes. Izuku determines that while they did carefully pick out the different zones, they didn't study the students' quirks, since they, they sent someone like Tsuyu to the flood zone. But the difference here is that unlike canon, while Deku, his quirk gives him strength, he doesn't have like the air pressure that One For All has, He can't just like punch or flick and like cause a massive water to come through, so it won't work that same way. So they're trying to think of another thing that could work against them. And of course, the leader of the group slices the boat in two using his quirk, and he warns the trio that they only have a few seconds left. And Mineta starts freaking out, and while Tsuyu looks a lot more composed, her shaking, Izuku tries his hardest to think, and his head begins to thump again as he visualizes all for one again. And the words accept begin to flow in his head again, and he starts to get a surge of pain. But this time, that isn't all. The man keeps speaking, and he says, accept your instinct. And as the boat begins to sink even more, Izuku tries to think hard about what his instincts tell him, and he closes his eyes once again and thinks. And he closes his eyes again and tries his hardest to understand what those words mean. But after that, only one word appears in his mind, and it's take. And Tsuyu and Mineta hear him say this, and they're like, take. And Tsuyu prepares to ask Izuku what he meant by that before he jumps into the air, and his dark gaze is centered on the man who sliced the boat in half. And Tsuyu calls out for him, but overcome by fear, she's unable to dive in after him. Tsuyu and Mineta watch as he falls to what they believe to be his grave. And Izuku extends his arm towards the group leader, but before he lands, the gauntlet on his right arm slowly turns and morphs into the form of a ravenous, growling fanged mouth. And the leader sees it, he's like, what the hell? Before he can really react, Izuku lands on him and that arm bites hard into his skin, and it draws blood into the water. He screams in pain and tries to pull the boy off, but he realizes that his strength is rapidly leaving his body. He struggles fruitlessly as Izuku slowly sinks into the water, and blood begins to spread where that man used to be. After a while, Izuku returns from below the water, but they see that his eyes are different. It was primal, hostile even. That glitter that bore into the villains made their non-existent hair stand on end. The hesitation gave the boy a clear shot, and he took it. He raised his hands from the water and cut in diagonal motion, and with it, water rose from the surface and attacked the villains without mercy. After that, Tsuyu and Mineta were absolutely shocked at what they saw, but they didn't really have time to think about it, because Izuku turned around and said, "Quick, jump!" When they heard him say this, they both nodded and fell into the water where the boy was, and as he grabs hold of both of them, his legs kick forward, and like a boat, he bursts forward with speed towards land. And the three make it to the edge of the flood zone near the center of USJ, where Aizawa fought the main force and let out relieved sighs. Mineta is crouched down. He's like, "We're alive! We're alive!" And Tsuyu turns to Izuku and says, "Izuku, what did you do back there?" And he shakes his head and says, "I'm not sure. I just let my instincts take over." And Mineta's just like, "What the fuck ever. Whatever you did saved our asses." And Izuku shakes his head and says, "No. They may have slowed them, but there's no way it took them all out. They'll attack us with more caution if we remain in the water." And Tsuyu and Mineta agree with this, and she says, "Okay then, so what should we do? Help Aizawa-sensei?" And he says, "No, we would only hinder him as is. Everyone got sent to different zones by the man with the warp quirk. Those with Bakugo, Kirishima, Rumi, Iki, Tokoyami, or Todoroki should be fine. But even if one or more of them remain near the entrance, dealing with the warp quirk holder will still be difficult. We should get to the entrance and help at least one person escape." And the two nod and follow Izuku, who equipped his spear and planned to break the remaining villain to the entrance. But a certain familiar sight caused him to freeze, one he somehow didn't manage to pick up before. Izuku mutters no as he notices the Nomu pinning Aizawa down and crushing his arm with absolute ease. And the three, of course, like Kennedy, look on in absolute horror and felt foolish that they even began to think that the situation was getting better. But the one who felt the absolute worst was Izuku, because he recognized the Nomu. He remembered his training with All For One back a few months ago, and realized that thing was the exact same thing he had fought back then. He also realized that All For One mentioned something about testing them, and it didn't take much for him to realize that he was part of the reason while this was happening. In his mind, this entire thing was his fault. Kurogiri appeared beside Shigaraki and told him that Ida had escaped, and Mineta felt happy hearing this news because he assumed that they would be saved. But the trio was caught off guard by Shigaraki, who decided that he wanted to cause some collateral damage before he left. In Light Cannon, his hand reaches for Tsuyu first, but was stopped in its tracks by Izuku, not just Aizawa. Izuku activated his gauntlet, grabbed Shigaraki's arm, and absolutely crushed it under his strength as he was whispering no. His beast-like eyes his eyes turned slit again, and he glared at Shigaraki, who returned that look with a creepy smile. He said, "Oh, how scary." Izuku let out one final no, as in a fit of rage, he summoned all the strength he had and used his spear to send a razor-sharp sword in the water in Shigaraki's direction. But like normal, it was completely guarded by the Nomu. It did leave a gash on his stomach, but of course with the super healing, it didn't really do much. That said, Izuku was far from done with his attack. He spat out a ball of flames towards Shigaraki and let the Nomu tank it again, but this time he quickly followed it up with a thrust of his spear into the Nomu's chest. Using all the strength he had at his disposal, Izuku let out a heavy roar and slowly but surely picked up the Nomu and used his flames to roast it alive in hopes that his super regeneration wouldn't be able to keep up. He turned to Tsuyu and Mineta and said, "Go, now!" And the two of them, even though they were shocked at what was happening, nodded and ran away. Shigaraki tried to go for them but was stopped by a ball of flames from Izuku. And Kurogiri, who realized that the situation was basically unsalvageable at this point, turned to Shigaraki and says, "Shigaraki, let us cut our losses and make our escape." And Shigaraki, even though he wants to stay, knows that he's losing here and basically says, "Fine. Be glad I'm not allowed to kill you, bastard." After he says that, the Nomu immediately breaks Izuku's spear through the flames and grabs his neck, almost breaking it completely in the process. And he sees Shigaraki's creepy smile again as he says, "Doesn't mean I can't torture you for a bit. Nomu, break his fingers and peel his skin for me." The Nomu obeyed and began breaking Izuku's fingers one by one. The pain was excruciating, but the boy remained quiet with only a few grunts. It was when the Nomu began peeling his skin that he truly began to yell out in pain. It was not good at doing its job. When it failed to grab him by the skin, it would crack his arm bones. And when it did, it would pull parts of his muscles as well. Izuku struggled to hold in his tears as Shigaraki got his kicks out of seeing the boy suffer. Tsuyu and Mineta saw this sight, and they were just in shock. They didn't know what to do, and Tsuyu felt ashamed that she couldn't do much at all to help. And in that exact moment, the USJ entrance swung wide open and revealed All Might, who he was standing there with that like furious expression. And Mineta's like, "We're saved! All Might's here!" And Izuku sees this, and in like a weak voice, he says, "Dad." Shigaraki looks at All Might and smiles and says, "Looks like we gotta continue, Nomu. Break one of his arms and toss him. The real final boss is here." And Nomu grabs the skinned arm and crushes it, causing even more blood and chunks to fly out as he threw Izuku aside. The boy was in just as, if not worse condition than Aizawa, but was still able enough to see All Might take out the villains in his way, pick him and Aizawa up, place them in Mineta and Tsuyu's arms, and stand before Shigaraki and Nomu in seconds. And that shocked everyone. And he turns to Tsuyu and says, "Young Asui, take young Midori to the entrance. I'll deal with them." And I should just say that All Might here is far angrier than he was in normal, because he was angry that the kids were hurt in canon, but now he saw his son's condition and his comrade's condition, and he's just furious at this point. And Izuku turns to him and says, "All Might, that thing has regeneration and shock absorption." And All Might gives the boy a thumbs up in response and says, "You've done well protecting your sensei and peers. Let the pros deal with the rest." And All Might is just like fucking the Nomu up at this point, while Tsuyu and Mineta are watching in absolute awe. But because they have both Izuku and Aizawa, they don't stay long and they begin to walk away. But Tsuyu is stopped by Izuku, who alerts the two after Kurogiri used his warp gate to catch All Might in that hole when he suplexed Nomu. And before Izuku can do anything, Todoroki shows up and freezes Nomu's right side. And Ikki, Kirishima, and Bakugo all appear and pin Kurogiri down before he can do virtually anything. And Rumi appears lastly and breaks Nomu's hand, setting All Might free. And Shigaraki, of course, scratches his face and he's like, "Sheesh, kids these days are making our League of Villains look like laughing stocks." Rumi and Ikki see Izuku, and they run to him with absolute concern because they see the state of his arm. And they see Aizawa as well. And Ikki does the same after ensuring that Bakugo, he kept Kurogiri down and he was doing his old psycho thing, whatever. And Izuku sees the two girls and smiles when he says, "You're both okay. I'm glad. And after he says that, he begins coughing up blood. And Rumi begins to tear up a bit as her hands hover over Izuku, afraid that touching him in this state will worsen his wounds. And Izuku sees her brother, and she turns back to Shigaraki and Nomu with like a furious expression, like she's worse off than All Might is. And her eyes begin to light up as her quirk begins to go, not haywire, but in her furious state, it's gotten much more powerful. And all the fire from the fire zone and just around them began to converge around her and form a small pillar. And she turns to Shigaraki and says, "You sick fucks, I'll burn you till there's nothing left." Izuku turns that flame pillar into a spear and launches it towards Nomu, who attempts to catch it barehanded. But the intensity of the flames, even though they haven't changed color, they're still like damn near Endeavor's level of flames. And they tear at its skin, making it difficult for its regeneration to heal it. And Iki attempts to get in closer to the Nomu, but is held back by Kirishima. And as he's trying to hold her back, she's struggling and yelling as her flames grow even more intense. She sinks the flick, "I'll kill it! I'll burn that purple bastard to a crisp!" And Kirishima is trying to hold her back, and he has to use his hardening, because if he doesn't, he'll just get like horrible burns from it. He's like, "Calm down, Midoriya. We should let All Might handle the Nomu and get Izuku and Aizawa to safety." And even though she wants to disagree with him, she knows he's right. So she stops trying to fight it and turns around and uses the rest of her flames to just like push the lesser villains aside. Like they don't even mean shit to her at this point. And she turns to the others and says, "Fine, let's go." And All Might sees this and he lets out a relieved sigh. He's like, "Thank you, young Kirishima. Let me handle the rest." And the small group easily get through whatever's left of the villains. Like they don't mean anything to Class 1A. And the furious Iki carries Izuku, and Aizawa was given to Rumi and Kirishima. And the group managed to see All Might hit the Nomu with a flurry of attacks and send them flying. And in this, because All Might has yet to pass on One For All and was dealing with a Nomu that was burned and strained, he was able to defeat it with far less punches, and thus was able, he wasn't as in dire straits as he was before. And Shigaraki's, he lost way harder than he did in canon, and he accepts it and opens the gate to escape. However, Izuku found it weird that he only stuck his hand in the gate, and it was kind of small for his body as a whole. And he was the only one who noticed a faint black swirl behind All Might. And when he saw that, he immediately knew what Shigaraki was trying to do. So he quickly removed himself from Iki's grasp and ran towards his father with speed, even though his arm was fucked up, which surprised everybody. And as he began to activate his quirk again, his only thoughts were, "I can't use my arms, I need speed." And as he said it, it exactly happened. The dragon armor that usually formed on his arms had begun to form on his feet, and he got multiple times faster than he was before, and he blasted towards All Might and Shigaraki. He appeared right above All Might's head and kicked Shigaraki's hand before it managed to reach him. And claws on his leg armor caused 3 big gashes to form on Shigaraki's hand. And he pulls it back in pain, and he's like, "You've raised such good kids, All Might. Let's see if you can stay alive long enough to continue teaching them." And with that, Shigaraki vanishes from sight as all the other pro heroes appear and they round up the remaining villains. Even though he was in far better condition compared to canon, he was still beginning to revert back to his normal state. As he looked towards his son, he says, "I can't speak for your birth father, but you really are just like me, in all the good and worrying ways." And Izuku laughs as Kirishima and Rumi ran to check up on the two, but they were stopped by Cementos. Nezu and a few other heroes helped the pair and took them to the emergency room, where both Aizawa and Izuku were extensively cared for. As for Shigaraki, he returned to the bar in worse condition than he did in canon. And he turns to the TV and he says, "We lost. We weren't even close." And All Might consoles his successor, and he's like, "Don't fret now, Shigaraki. I half expected it to turn out this way. What's important is what you gathered about All Might and little Izuku." Shigaraki pauses for a moment and says, "All Might is strong. Too strong. He beat the Nomu by simply overpowering its regeneration. And the boy, he hit Nomu with water somehow. And when I tried to kill All Might, he managed to catch and stop it with that leg thing. He was strong too. He broke my arm. And all for one laughs a little bit and says, "Good. Then it's already setting in. My gift. You may have lost today, but we'll try again tomorrow. Have patience. You will prove to the world that like the symbol of peace, the symbol of terror will rise to combat it." Back at UA, Iki is looking at Toshinori, who's in bed in the recovery girl's office, and tears begin to fall from her eyes as she says, I couldn't do anything. Toshinori shakes his head and says, "That's not true. If not for you and Izuku, I likely wouldn't be here right now. You kids were wholly unprepared for the situation and still managed to walk out victorious. And for that, I'm eternally grateful." And Iki turns to her dad and says, "Why is it always him that jumps in first? Back when the sludge villain attacked, when Ochako got trapped under the debris, during the battle trials, and even now when facing legitimate villains, why is he always the first to act?" Toshinori rubbed his daughter's head gently as he smiled and said, "He's got my recognition somehow, that boy." She laughs as she wipes her tears and says, "Yeah, maybe he actually is your legitimate son." And Toshinori brings her for a hug and says, "What do you mean? You both are my legitimate children, no matter what." And as the two hug, Officer Naomasa enters the room, and because Iki knew him prior to this, she doesn't question his presence as he agrees to two. And, of course, All Might's like, "Sukachi, are the students okay? How Aizawa, number 13, and Izuku?" Now Masa places his hand on his chest and says, "Well, the kids are fine, just a few nicks here and there. The teachers are also not in life-threatening danger for the time being. As for your son, his right arm was far worse off than even Aizawa's. We assume that because of the state of his injuries, he will likely lose function of his arm, but it seems he has a healing factor of sorts that has already begun to mend his wounds." Toshinori let out a sigh and says, "That's good to hear." But Namasa stops him there and says, "I do have slightly concerning news though. As we rounded up the remaining villains, there was one that was far more jittery than the rest. He kept going on about how the long-haired boy did something to him and that he couldn't use his quirk. We were skeptical, of course, but upon closer inspection, his fins and gills have all ceased function. When Izuku wakes up, I'll ask him about it in more detail." Toshinori nods and says, "I understand. I'll ask him about it myself as well." Now Masa nods and bids his friend goodbye, and the bedridden Toshinori stares out the window with an unsettling feeling. A few days later, Izuku was up and able to return to school due to his healing factor speeding up the process. Aside from the scars left on his body and hand, he felt fine, and great even. The boy made it to the classroom at the exact same time as Aizawa, who was still massively bandaged. He turns to him and says, "Aizawa-sensei, are you sure you're able to move around like that?" And Aizawa scoffs and says, "You were in worse condition than I was. I'm more surprised you're so energetic." Izuku laughs and says, "Yeah, they said I have a healing factor of sorts that helped fix my broken arm for the most part." And Aizawa nods with him and says, "I also heard about the quirkless man. How do you feel?" Hearing this, Izuku's expression darkens a bit, and he says, "Great. And that's what bugs me about it. When I attacked him, I saw a vision of a man that told me to accept my instincts, and I did for the most part. Next thing I know, I'm swimming towards land with both Soyu and Mineta. I just don't understand it." Aizawa shakes his head and says, "Don't overthink it. You'll learn over time what your quirk truly is. For now, focus on honing that quirk to the best of your ability." Izuku nods and enters the classroom with Aizawa, but was caught off guard by a blurry figure that pounced onto him. He quickly recognized the figure as Rumi, who was tightly hugging him with both her hands and feet. And he says, "Hey, Rumi." And she snaps back at him and says, "Shut up. It's your fault for getting hurt like that, scaring me half to death." Izuku could only cave in and hug her back with a soft "I'm sorry" as compensation for warning her. And Aizawa separates the girl from Izuku with some effort and announces that the sports festival will begin shortly, making everyone feel like the USJ event wasn't even real. And that's where I'm going to end part 2 of What If Deku Had a Dragon Quirk. The pieces are all coming together, and it will be there soon. And just to note, Izuku does not have All For One, if that's what you're thinking. That's all I'm going to say. That's all I'm going to say. He does not have All For One. He has something much greater. But yeah, sorry if this one sounded bad, because in my opinion it was bad. I didn't realize that doing 2 of these in a row will make my throat so screwed up. So yeah. Damn it, I'm playing with my keys again. Sorry about that. In any case, like I said, both of these parts, both What If Deku Became an Otsutsuki Part 0 and this part should be out at the same time, as well as Part 1 for What If He Became an Otsutsuki and What If He Was Esdeath's son. I'm working on right now, so look out for that. If you like the video, show up for the next one. Give me ships because I could use them because I'm garbage at choosing ships. But aside from that, that's it. I'll see you guys later.